People today often picture pirates as adventurous outlaws with daring smiles, colorful clothes, and the freedom of the sea. Movies and books paint them as charming rogues, chasing treasure, living with excitement and danger, but somehow still lovable. That image is powerful. It has shaped the way people think about piracy for generations. But behind that story lies a truth that is darker than anyone wants to imagine. The truth is that women who were caught by pirates faced horrors so severe that they were rarely spoken of openly. Their lives were marked by fear, humiliation, and violence. If you clicked here expecting tales of adventure, you're about to discover the nightmare that existed behind the sails. To understand what happened to these women, we must first look at how pirates thought of women at all. Many pirate codes, written agreements that set rules on board ships, stated that women were not allowed on board. Sailors believed that a woman's presence was bad luck, that it would anger the sea or lead to fights between men. These rules might seem to suggest protection, but in reality they reflected deep fears and superstitions. If women were discovered, the punishment was brutal. Some were abandoned on lonely islands, left to die. Others were forced to hide who they were. A few brave women disguised themselves as men, hoping to escape notice. Two of the most famous examples are Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They dressed as men, fought as men, and lived in constant danger of discovery. Their stories became legends, but they only highlight how dangerous it was for a woman to exist in that world. For women captured by pirates, things were much worse. Ships often raided coastal villages, ports, or other ships not just for treasure, but for human cargo. Women were seen as prizes, sometimes even more valuable than gold. In many cases, they were seized with little thought given to their fate except as objects to be used. Sexual assault was common, brutal, and systematic. Captives lived in fear every moment, never knowing when they might be targeted or by whom. These attacks were not random acts of cruelty. They became a part of the way piracy functioned. A woman could be passed from one pirate to another. Sometimes she was kept as a shared possession among the crew. Other times she was sold at port for profit, reduced to a number on a list or a line in a ledger. Historical accounts reveal chilling details. In the 17th century, French records mention the abduction of women during raids in the Caribbean. Some were ransomed back to their families, but many were not so lucky. One disturbing report tells of a disabled French woman captured and subjected to repeated abuse. She was treated not as a human being, but as a tool for the crew's pleasure, her suffering ignored. Such stories were rarely written in detail because they were considered too shameful, yet whispers and fragments survive in letters, journals, and court documents. These fragments show that behind the noise of cannons and the thrill of treasure, another hidden economy was thriving, the economy of human suffering. The treatment of women as slaves or commodities grew worse as piracy changed over time. When ships became harder to capture and treasure less easy to find, pirates turned more and more to kidnapping for ransom. Women and children were the most common targets. Families who could pay were forced into desperation, selling land or borrowing large sums to buy back their loved ones. But ransom was not the only path. Many women were never ransomed. They were sold into slavery across the Caribbean, Africa, and even the Middle East. Pirates often had ties with slave traders, and captives could disappear into networks that stretched across a continent. Once a woman entered that system, her chances of returning home were almost zero. This organized cruelty was not only about profit, it was also about power. By capturing and abusing women, pirates demonstrated their dominance. They showed their crew and their enemies that they could take what they wanted without limit. These acts became part of the terror that piracy spread. It was not enough to threaten a man's life or property. Pirates wanted to crush his spirit by targeting the women he cared about. This is why, for many communities, The fear of pirates was not just about losing wealth, but about the unbearable thought of losing daughters, wives, and mothers into a world of abuse. One of the most chilling truths about this hidden world is how systematic it became. The abuse of women by pirates was not just a side effect of violence, it was part of a larger pattern that repeated across oceans and generations. Many pirate crews developed unspoken rules about how to divide female captives. Some women were kept aboard for days, others for weeks, and some for longer, depending on the choices of the crew. They could be passed around like spoils of war, their suffering ignored because the men believed they had a right to take whatever they conquered. In the silence of the sea there were no laws, no courts, and no rescue waiting over the horizon. Pirates also understood that women could be valuable bargaining chips. In many regions, the kidnapping of women became a strategy as common as stealing gold. A young woman from a wealthy family might be worth more in ransom than the treasure in a merchant's hold. Pirates exploited this, targeting ships or towns where they knew influential families lived. The terror spread by such raids was not only about money. It broke the will of communities. Families lived with the constant fear that their daughters could be taken at any moment, and once taken, their fate was uncertain. Even if ransom was paid, there was no guarantee of safe return. Sometimes, families received only the broken remains of what had once been a loved one. Accounts from North Africa's Barbary corsairs reveal how organized this trade in women could be. Pirates linked to the Barbary states raided coastal villages in Europe, capturing women and children in their thousands. These captives were marched to slave markets in Algiers, Tunis, or Tripoli, where they were inspected like livestock. Age, beauty, and health determined their price. The most desirable were sold to wealthy buyers, often forced into lives as concubines. The less desirable were sent into hard labor, stripped of dignity and family ties. Behind the colorful legends of pirates lies this grim reality. Women were treated as property, valued only for how much suffering or profit they could yield. Even within European waters, the story was much the same. Pirates who prowled the English Channel or the Mediterranean also seized women when opportunities arose. Some were dragged aboard ships and forced to live among crews for weeks at a time, enduring abuse until they were abandoned on shore or sold. The emotional torment of captivity was sometimes worse than the physical pain. Women lived with the constant uncertainty of what might happen next, stripped of control over their own bodies and futures. For many, the sea was not a symbol of freedom, but a prison without walls. It is easy today to imagine pirates as rebels against the system, men who fought against oppressive kings and merchants. But when it came to women, they often became the very oppressors they claimed to resist. Their ships were floating cages where cruelty became routine. The silence of history on these matters is telling. Chroniclers often skipped over the details, not because the crimes did not happen, but because the truth was too unbearable to put into words. When fragments do survive, they reveal a picture so bleak that it shatters the romantic myths forever. The stories of women who tried to resist only underline the hopelessness of their situation. Some jumped into the sea rather than endure captivity. Others fought desperately, using whatever weapons they could find, but were quickly overpowered. A few tried to bargain for their lives, offering promises of ransom or pleading for mercy. Rarely did these pleas change the outcome. Pirates thrived on fear. By making examples of women, they sent a message to others. Resistance was useless, and surrender meant survival. Yet survival often meant a fate worse than death. The legacy of these horrors lingers in small traces. Folk songs, whispered stories, and local legends across Europe and the Caribbean speak of women taken by pirates, never to return. In Ireland, tales tell of coastal villages emptied by raiders who carried off entire families. In Spain, mothers frightened children with warnings that pirates would come if they misbehaved. These warnings were not just empty threats. They reflected lived realities of communities that had suffered unimaginable losses. Behind every song and story is the memory of someone who vanished into the shadows of piracy. One of the most chilling truths about this hidden world is how systematic it became. The abuse of women by pirates was not just a side effect of violence, it was part of a larger pattern that repeated across oceans and generations. Many pirate crews developed unspoken rules about how to divide female captives. Some women were kept aboard for days, others for weeks, and some for longer, depending on the choices of the crew. They could be passed around like spoils of war, their suffering ignored because the men believed they had a right to take whatever they conquered. In the silence of the sea, there were no laws, no courts, and no rescue waiting over the horizon. Pirates also understood that women could be valuable bargaining chips. In many regions, the kidnapping of women became a strategy as common as stealing gold. A young woman from a wealthy family might be worth more in ransom than the treasure in a merchant's hold. Pirates exploited this, targeting ships or towns where they knew influential families lived. The terror spread by such raids was not only about money. It broke the will of communities. Families lived with the constant fear that their daughters could be taken at any moment, and once taken, their fate was uncertain. Even if ransom was paid, there was no guarantee of safe return. Sometimes families received only the broken remains of what had once been a loved one. Even women who became part of pirate crews lived in constant danger. The famous Anne Bonny and Mary Red may be remembered as fierce fighters who broke gender barriers, but their survival was the exception, not the rule. Countless other women who attempted to disguise themselves as men were discovered and punished. Some were executed, others were abandoned at sea, and many were subjected to relentless abuse. Their stories rarely survived because no one wanted to record the humiliation of women who had dared to step into a world ruled by men. The legends of Bonny and Red shine brightly today, but they stand atop the shadows of countless forgotten women who did not live long enough to leave their names behind. The brutality did not stop with captivity. For some women, the horrors continued even after supposed freedom was won. Those who were ransomed or managed to escape often faced rejection from their own families and communities. Instead of being welcomed home, they were marked as dishonored, as though the crimes committed against them had erased their worth. This cruel social stigma silenced survivors, making it harder for future generations to know the full truth. Pirates had managed to steal not only women's freedom, but also their place in history, erasing them twice over, first by violence, then by shame. The economic side of this cruelty cannot be ignored. Pirates, especially in regions like the Barbary Coast, developed entire systems for handling female captives. They categorized women, set prices, and negotiated trades. Records exist of markets where women were valued like livestock, with beauty, age, and virginity carefully noted to maximize profit. Some documents even describe price lists, with higher amounts demanded for young, healthy women and far less for older or injured captives. The coldness of these records strips away any illusion of piracy as chaotic or spontaneous. It was an organized trade, as systematic as any business, except its currency was human lives. Communities lived under constant threat of these practices. Entire coastal regions were abandoned out of fear of raids. Villagers moved inland, leaving behind fertile land and fishing towns to avoid the fate of their neighbors. This retreat reshaped geography itself, turning once thriving coasts into silent reminders of terror. In some places, churches built massive walls, not to keep out armies, but to protect against pirate accounts from North Africa's Barbary corsairs, reveal how organized this trade in women could be. Pirates linked to the Barbary states raided coastal villages in Europe, capturing women and children in their thousands. These captives were marched to slave markets in Algiers, Tunis, or Tripoli, where they were inspected like livestock. Age, beauty, and health determined their price. The most desirable were sold to wealthy buyers, often forced into lives as concubines. The less desirable were sent into hard labor, stripped of dignity and family ties. Behind the colorful legends of pirates lies this grim reality. Women were treated as property, valued only for how much suffering or profit they could yield. Even within European waters, the story was much the same. Pirates who prowled the English Channel or the Mediterranean also seized women when opportunities arose. Some were dragged aboard ships and forced to live among crews for weeks at a time, enduring abuse until they were abandoned on shore or sold. The emotional torment of captivity was sometimes worse than the physical pain. Women lived with the constant uncertainty of what might happen next, stripped of control over their own bodies and futures. For many, the sea was not a symbol of freedom, but a prison without walls. It is easy today to imagine pirates as rebels against the system, men who fought against oppressive kings and merchants, but when it came to women, they often became the very oppressors they claimed to resist. Their ships were floating cages where cruelty became routine. The silence of history on these matters is telling. Chroniclers often skipped over the details, not because the crimes did not happen, but because the truth was too unbearable to put into words. When fragments do survive, they reveal a picture so bleak that it shatters the romantic myths forever. The stories of women who tried to resist only underline the hopelessness of their situation. Some jumped into the sea rather than endure captivity. Others fought desperately, using whatever weapons they could find, but were quickly overpowered. A few tried to bargain for their lives, offering promises of ransom or pleading for mercy. Rarely did these pleas change the outcome. Pirates thrived on fear. By making examples of women, they sent a message to others. Resistance was useless, and surrender meant survival. Yet survival often meant a fate worse than death. The legacy of these horrors lingers in small traces. Folk songs, whispered stories, and local legends across Europe and the Caribbean speak of women taken by pirates, never to return. In Ireland, tales tell of coastal villages emptied by raiders who carried off entire families. In Spain, mothers frightened children with warnings that pirates would come if they misbehaved. These warnings were not just empty threats. They reflected lived realities of communities that had suffered unimaginable losses. Behind every song and story is the memory of someone who vanished into the shadows of piracy. As piracy grew in scale, so did the cruelty. Many pirate groups began to treat human trafficking as part of their business model. When treasure fleets became harder to raid due to stronger naval defenses, women and children became easier targets. They were portable, profitable, and, tragically, plentiful. This shift reveals how piracy was not just a violent lifestyle, but also an economy built on suffering. The taking of women was not a rare accident. It was an intentional act that filled pirate coffers and spread fear across entire coastlines. Historical evidence shows how calculated this trade could be. In some slave markets tied to piracy, women were priced based on age, beauty, and even their ability to bear children. Younger women fetched the highest prices, often bought by wealthy men for private use. Older women, or those considered less attractive, were sold for hard labor. Families knew these grim truths, and some resorted to desperate measures. In parts of Europe, records mention parents scarring their daughters' faces in hopes of making them less desirable to raiders. Imagine the pain of a parent forced to choose between disfiguring their child and risking her capture. Such choices reveal the depth of terror piracy inflicted, a terror that reached far beyond the sea itself. One detail that often gets overlooked is how widespread these raids were. In the Mediterranean alone, hundreds of thousands of Europeans were captured over several centuries by Barbary pirates. Among them were countless women who disappeared into lives of slavery. Their voices are mostly lost, but their absence haunts the records. Letters written by desperate husbands, parents and priests beg for the return of wives, daughters, and sisters. Ransom funds were collected in churches and villages, but they were rarely enough. Communities sold cattle, fields, and even churches themselves to try to raise the money. The economy of ransom drained entire regions, leaving scars that lasted for generations. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the same horrors unfolded in a different setting. Pirates there targeted Spanish colonies and passing merchant ships. When silver shipments became harder to intercept, pirates turned to people. Women taken from coastal villages often ended up in hidden pirate havens, where they were subjected to repeated assaults before being sold onto other colonies. Rumors spread of caves and coves where captives were held in chains. Some survivors who escaped described their ordeal, but many stories were silenced, either because victims could not bear to tell them or because society preferred not to hear. The suffering of these women was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Captivity destroyed their sense of safety and identity. Many never recovered, even if they managed to return home. In some societies, women who survived pirate captivity were shunned, seen as tainted or dishonored. Instead of receiving comfort, they were met with suspicion and shame. This added another layer of cruelty, forcing victims to carry their trauma in silence. Pirates had not only stolen their freedom, but had also stolen their place within their own communities. Pirates themselves seemed to understand this psychological weapon. By targeting women, they destabilized entire societies. A raid that captured treasure might weaken a region's wealth, but a raid that captured women shattered its spirit. Families lived with the knowledge that their loved ones might never return, or worse, might return broken in ways they could not heal. Communities passed down these stories as warnings, and the fear of pirates became a tool of control even after the raiders had left. In this way, the terror pirates spread lingered long after their ships had sailed away. It is tempting to think of piracy as a short chapter in history, but these practices lasted for centuries. From the 17th through the 19th centuries, women were captured, sold, and abused in patterns that repeated across oceans. The names of the pirates may have changed, but the suffering of their victims remained constant. This is the hidden reality behind the romantic image of men with cutlasses and treasure maps. For women, piracy was not an adventure. It was a nightmare that swallowed their lives and erased their voices from history. The organized cruelty of pirates was not only about money or fear, it was also about dominance. In many raids, pirates chose to humiliate women publicly, turning their suffering into a spectacle meant to break entire communities. Reports from coastal Europe describe how raiders sometimes dragged women into town squares, forcing them to watch their homes burn before carrying them away. These acts were not random. They were designed to send a message: resistance was useless, and pirates held absolute power over both land and sea. In this way, women's bodies became battlefields where pirates fought not just for wealth, but for control of the human spirit. In the Caribbean, the stories of captive women often disappeared beneath layers of legend. Some were hidden by families ashamed of what had happened. Others were suppressed by governments eager to downplay their inability to protect their people. Yet fragments remain. A Spanish nun taken during a raid in the 17th century wrote a desperate account of her captivity, describing nights filled with terror and days filled with hopeless waiting. She pleaded for rescue, but also confessed the deeper wound of knowing she might never be seen as the same person again if she returned. Her testimony shows how captivity was not only a physical prison, but also a lifelong sentence of shame and silence. Who came for women and children. These physical scars of fear remain in ruins and records, a silent testimony to the horrors that reshaped daily life. The silence surrounding these crimes is one of the greatest tragedies of history. While tales of pirate battles, buried treasure, and daring escapes were written down and shared, The voices of the women who suffered were pushed into the shadows. Chroniclers, mostly men, often chose not to include the grim details of female captivity. They preferred to focus on dramatic sea battles or the wealth stolen from galleons. The suffering of women did not fit the romantic image of piracy that readers wanted to hear. As a result, countless stories were erased before they could even be told. Yet in rare moments, the truth breaks. Through letters from church officials, ransom notes and fragments of testimony provide glimpses into the nightmare. A priest from Italy described entire congregations weeping as women were marched away by raiders. A ransom note written by desperate parents begged pirates to return their daughter, offering land and lifelong servitude in exchange. These pieces of evidence may be small, but together they form a pattern. Women were not bystanders in the story of piracy. They were among its central victims. The psychological weight of this silence cannot be overstated. For survivors, even speaking about what had happened was often impossible. Shame clung to them, whether or not they had chosen their fate. Communities judged them harshly, as though being taken captive was their fault. This cruel reaction made it easier for society to ignore their pain, leaving them trapped in isolation. In this way, pirates continued to control their victims even after the chains were gone. Silence became another prison, one that could last for a lifetime. The calculated cruelty of piracy extended beyond individuals to entire families. Pirates understood that by targeting women, they struck at the heart of a community. When a daughter, sister, or wife was taken, the family was left broken. Fathers who had failed to protect their homes carried guilt until their deaths. Brothers who could not rescue their sisters were haunted by rage. Husbands who lost wives to raids often abandoned their homes rather than live with the reminder. This ripple effect spread far and wide, ensuring that a single act of piracy could destroy not just one life, but dozens of others connected to it. Yet even in this silence, the truth seeps through. A letter from a French priest describes entire congregations kneeling in prayer for women taken in a raid, their cries echoing through the church like a funeral for the living. A ransom record from Spain lists a woman's name beside the price demanded for her freedom, turning her life into a transaction. A diary from a Dutch merchant mentions women taken during an attack, noting their absence with chilling brevity. These scraps of evidence, scattered across archives, prove that the horrors were real, even if history preferred to look away. The brutality of pirates toward women also exposed the hypocrisy of the age. Many pirates claimed to fight against oppressive empires, to seek freedom from kings and merchants. Yet in their treatment of women, they became the very tyrants they claimed to resist. Their freedom was purchased with the suffering of others, their rebellion built on the broken bodies of their victims. This hypocrisy reveals that piracy was never about justice or fairness. It was about power, and women bore the heaviest cost of that pursuit. For the women themselves, captivity often blurred the line between survival and resistance. Some learned to endure by becoming invisible, staying silent to avoid drawing attention. Others used small acts of defiance, like hiding food or helping each other survive abuse. A few seized moments of chaos to escape, running into jungles, mountains, or forests when raids left gaps in control. These moments of bravery, though rarely recorded, show that women were not only passive victims, but also active fighters for their own survival. Their resistance, no matter how small, deserves to be honored as much as any pirate's so-called bravery at sea. The tragedy is that most of these women never had the chance to tell their stories. Their names were lost, their voices silenced, their lives erased by the double violence of captivity and memory. But the fragments that remain, scattered across songs, letters, and records, speak loudly enough. They tell us that the hidden horrors of piracy were not accidents or side effects, but central to the way pirates lived and thrived. And they remind us that behind every romantic tale of a pirate ship was a reality soaked in the suffering of women. The global nature of piracy meant that the suffering of women spanned continents. In the Mediterranean, Barbary corsairs carried women to markets in Algiers and Tunis. In the Caribbean, women vanished into the hidden coves of Jamaica, Hispaniola, and the Bahamas. In Asia, pirates along the Chinese coast raided villages, seizing women who were then sold into brothels or forced to serve wealthy buyers. No region of the world was untouched. Wherever the sea carried pirate ships, women lived under the threat of capture. This universality reveals that piracy was not simply a local problem, but a global plague, tied together by networks of exploitation. What makes this reality so disturbing is how organized it became. Pirates were not merely wild criminals acting on impulse. They were part of systems that linked them to traders, corrupt officials, and even local leaders who profited from the trade in human beings. In many cases, pirates could not have sold women without the cooperation of land-based buyers who were ready to receive them. This partnership blurred the lines between piracy and mainstream commerce. It shows how deeply society itself was complicit in sustaining the horrors women endured. Pirates may have been the raiders, but they were not acting alone. The calculated cruelty extended to the way women were categorized. Some records describe pirates separating captives into groups before sale. Young women were valued for concubinage, older women for labor, and children for both. These divisions stripped individuals of their humanity, reducing them to roles in a market that saw nothing but profit. Families were torn apart as mothers, and daughters were sold to different buyers, never to see each other again. The grief of such separations reverberated far beyond the individuals, leaving communities broken and powerless to heal. This trauma was compounded by the fact that many women never returned home. Unlike men, who might be ransomed or exchanged, women often disappeared permanently into the system of slavery. Their absence haunted the families left behind. Empty seats at tables, unmarked graves, and unanswered prayers became the only memorials. In some places, people lit candles for the missing every year, keeping alive the hope that they might one day return. But most never did. Their lives ended in silence, erased by the sea and by the cruelty of those who profited from their suffering. The psychological impact of this absence cannot be overstated. For communities, every missing woman represented not just a personal loss, but also a cultural wound. Weddings went uncelebrated, families left no descendants, and villages declined as generations of women vanished. This slow erosion reshaped entire regions, leaving scars that persisted for centuries. In this way, piracy was not just a crime of the moment, but a force that reshaped the course of history through the destruction of women's lives. The silence of mainstream history makes these truths even more urgent to tell. For too long, the suffering of women has been erased from the story of piracy. We remember captains with colorful names and ships with black flags, but we forget the countless women who vanished into the shadows they cast. To bring these stories forward is not to strip away adventure, but to reveal the cost of that adventure. It forces us to ask what we are really celebrating when we romanticize pirates. Are we honoring rebels, or are we ignoring victims? The answer matters, because the myths we tell shape the world we live in today. The cruelty of piracy also reveals the fragility of justice in the early modern world. Courts occasionally captured and tried pirates, but the focus was almost always on stolen treasure or murdered sailors. The voices of women, if they appeared at all, were buried in short lines about spoils or prizes. Rarely did testimony describe the personal horror of captivity. When women did testify, their words were often dismissed as exaggerations or ignored altogether. This legal silence shows how deeply society failed its most vulnerable victims. Pirates may have wielded the swords, but courts and governments allowed their crimes against women to vanish into obscurity. there were exceptions, rare flashes when the truth broke through. In one English trial, a captive woman described in vivid detail how she had been passed from one pirate to another. Her pleas for mercy met with laughter. Her testimony shocked the court, but instead of inspiring widespread reform, it was treated as an isolated atrocity. This unwillingness to confront the systemic nature of the crimes meant that piracy continued to thrive. For every woman brave enough to speak, countless others remained silent, either because they feared disbelief or because they had no safe place to tell their stories. The hypocrisy of the time is clear. Nations celebrated naval victories over pirates, boasting of captured ships and executed captains. Yet they failed to protect or honor the women whose lives had been shattered. A golden chalice recovered from a raid might be displayed in a church, but the women taken during the same attack were forgotten. This selective memory reveals much about priorities. Material wealth mattered more than human suffering. The absence of women's voices in these records is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate choices about what was worth remembering. This silence continued into the modern age, shaping how pirates are remembered in popular culture. Novels and films turned them into anti-heroes, rebels who lived outside the law. Their violence was recast as adventure, their cruelty as charm. The women they harmed were erased, replaced with fictional damsels or romantic interests. This distortion ensured that the myth of piracy survived while the truth was buried. Even today, when we hear the word pirate, we are more likely to imagine a colorful character from a children's story than the real terror that once haunted the seas. But memory has a way of surviving in unexpected places. In some coastal communities, shrines still stand to honor women who were lost to the sea. Families tell stories of grandmothers or great-aunts who vanished during raids, their names carried forward like fragile relics. These memories, though private, resist the erasure of official history. They insist that the suffering of women cannot be entirely forgotten, no matter how much the world prefers to look away. In these stories, we find the beginnings of justice, not in courts or books, but in the determination of families to remember. The lesson is clear. Piracy was not an adventure, but a nightmare, and its victims deserve to be remembered. By bringing their stories into the light, we confront not only the cruelty of pirates, but also the silence of history that allowed those crimes to be hidden. To acknowledge their suffering is to restore humanity to those who were denied it. It is to declare that the lives of women matter as much as any treasure ever pulled from the sea. Their absence is not just a detail of history. It is a defining truth that reshapes everything we think we know about the age of piracy. The climax of this hidden history is not found in dramatic battles or glittering treasure, but in the cold efficiency of human exploitation. Pirates turned women into commodities, traded their lives for gold, and used their suffering as tools of fear. What makes this truth most horrifying is how systematic it became. Price lists, ransom notes, and silent ledgers reveal a machinery of cruelty, one that treated women as units of value rather than human beings. To understand piracy honestly is to face this reality head-on. The freedom pirates celebrated was built on the captivity of others. For the women themselves, the nightmare was total. Their identities were stripped, their bodies violated, and their futures stolen. Some resisted, others endured, but all carried scars that history rarely acknowledges. When we remember pirates as charming rogues, we erase these women a second time. Their stories deserve more than silence. They deserve to be told in full, with all the horror and all the humanity they endured. Only then can we begin to understand the true legacy of piracy. The resolution lies not in romantic myths, but in truth. Piracy was not rebellion. It was not freedom. It was an economy of terror, and women bore the heaviest cost. By seizing women, pirates destabilized communities, enriched themselves, and spread fear across continents. They shattered families, erased futures, and left scars that lasted for centuries. This is the reality hidden beneath the songs and stories we still tell today. To confront it is to strip away the mask of adventure and reveal the suffering beneath. The final message is simple but powerful. History has long buried the voices of women captured by pirates, but they cannot remain silent forever. Their absence speaks louder than the myths that replace them. Every folk song, every whispered story, every fragment of testimony reminds us that these women lived, suffered, and mattered. They were not nameless shadows. They were human beings whose lives were stolen by the sea. To tell their story now is to give them back the dignity they were denied. And so, the next time you hear a tale of pirates as daring heroes, remember what the myths conceal. Behind every cannon blast and treasure chest was a darker truth. Women captured, violated, and erased from history. That is the hidden horror of piracy, the truth that reshapes everything we thought we knew about life on the high seas. If you found this story eye-opening, don't let it sink back into silence. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden histories, and join the conversation about the truths that history tried to bury. Together, we can keep these stories alive and make sure the voices of the forgotten are finally heard. Even the legends that survive today carry hidden truths. When ballads or folk tales mention women captured by pirates, they often portray them as tragic figures, symbols of loss rather than people with voices of their own. These songs kept the memory alive, but they also reduced women to symbols instead of individuals. They were remembered not for who they were, but for what they represented: the terror of piracy. Behind every anonymous verse was a real person, with a name, a family, and a story now lost forever. Some historians argue that this silence was no accident. Governments and merchants had reasons to downplay the vulnerability of women to pirates. Admitting that women could be taken so easily meant admitting failure to protect them. It exposed the weakness of naval defenses, the corruption of officials, and the powerlessness of entire empires. By focusing on the swashbuckling myths, history was able to hide its own shame. In doing so, it condemned generations of women to be forgotten victims, but forgetting does not erase the truth. The reality is that piracy thrived not only on stolen gold, but also on stolen lives. Women, treated as spoils of war, became the hidden currency of the seas. Every raid, every ransom, every sale carved another wound into history. These wounds may not appear in the bright stories of adventure, but they remain etched in the lives destroyed and the voices silenced. And to remember them now is to strip away the mask of romance that has long protected the reputation of pirates. The cruelty of pirates toward women also reveals something about the darker side of human nature. On the open sea, where laws held little power, men acted without restraint. For many crews, the capture of women was not just about profit, but also about indulging violent desires they could never satisfy on land. Life on board was harsh and monotonous, filled with danger and long stretches of waiting. When women were captured, they became outlets for anger, lust, and frustration. This mix of boredom and brutality created an environment where cruelty flourished unchecked. Some captains tried to maintain control, but many looked the other way, knowing that keeping their crews satisfied reduced the risk of mutiny. In pirate codes, there are occasional mentions of rules about women, but these rules were rarely about protection. More often, they were about ownership, dictating who among the crew had rights to a captive. Women were divided like treasure, claimed through lots or by the strongest voices on board. Even when written laws existed, they served only to regulate exploitation, not to prevent it. This shows how deeply abuse was woven into the fabric of piracy. The use of women as bargaining chips also expanded beyond ransom. In some cases, pirates offered captives as gifts to secure alliances with local leaders or to gain shelter in ports. A woman's fate could be decided in a single conversation, her future traded for food, supplies, or safe harbor. These exchanges reduced human beings to tokens of diplomacy in a shadow world where violence was the only language that mattered. Every transaction deepened the sense that piracy was not simply robbery, but a system of exploitation sustained by suffering. For the women themselves, captivity was a constant battle to survive. Some learned to adapt, trying to appease their captors in hopes of avoiding worse treatment. Others resisted quietly, hiding food, whispering prayers, or plotting escape. A few found small acts of defiance, spitting in their captors' faces, refusing to speak, or protecting younger girls from the worst abuses. These acts may seem small, but in the context of such overwhelming violence, they were moments of extraordinary courage. They remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit seeks ways to fight back. Yet survival often came with scars too deep to heal. Women who lived through pirate captivity carried trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Some were haunted by nightmares, others by silence. A few were forced into marriages after captivity, treated as unwanted burdens rather than as victims deserving care. Their voices are missing from most official records because they rarely had the chance to tell their stories. When they did, their accounts were often dismissed as exaggerations, because the truth was too terrible for society to accept. This dismissal allowed piracy's crimes to remain hidden, wrapped in myths that excused or ignored the suffering of women. Communities that endured these losses never forgot. In coastal villages across Europe and the Caribbean, people told children not to wander near the sea after dark, warning that pirates would come for them. These warnings were not fables, but memories passed down. The sea, once a source of food and trade, became a place of dread. Generations grew up with the knowledge that the ocean could bring horror to their doorsteps at any time. This cultural memory shaped how entire regions related to the water, turning natural fear into a way of life. The irony is that the very seas that pirates used to spread terror also carried the whispers of their crimes. Sailors told stories in ports, spreading rumors of women taken and never seen again. Merchants recorded losses in ledgers that listed captives alongside stolen cargo. Priests wrote desperate letters begging for aid. These small records, scattered across history, are all that remain of thousands of untold stories. They may be fragments, but together they paint a clear picture. For women, piracy was not an adventure, but a descent into a world of horror and dehumanization. As piracy spread across the world's oceans, the horrors inflicted on women grew in both scale and organization. In Asia, pirates along the South China Sea mirrored the same patterns seen in Europe and the Caribbean. Women from fishing villages were carried away during raids, forced into slavery, or sold into brothels in distant ports. Some were dragged onto ships and used as entertainment for crews that might number in the hundreds. The scale of suffering was staggering, yet these stories rarely traveled beyond local communities. The victims vanished, and the world outside remained blind to their pain. What makes these stories even more disturbing is how piracy often exploited existing systems of oppression. Where slavery already existed, pirates fed into it. Where social structures devalued women, pirates pushed those values to extremes. In places where women were already denied power or autonomy, piracy turned them into currency. This meant that the suffering of women under piracy was not just an isolated crime, but part of a much larger pattern of exploitation that reached across continents. Pirates became parasites, feeding off the weaknesses of the societies they preyed upon. One chilling example comes from the Barbary Coast, where raids on European villages became so common that people began to abandon entire stretches of coastline. In some cases, women were taken in such numbers that local populations never recovered. Generations later, these absences were still felt in census records, where the missing are counted not by name, but by silence. The sheer scale of these abductions is difficult to imagine today. It was not a few isolated attacks, but a system of capture and sale that lasted for centuries, touching the lives of thousands upon thousands of women. The human cost of these raids cannot be measured only in numbers. Each woman carried her own story of terror, resistance, or loss. A mother torn from her children, a young bride taken on the night of her wedding, a sister who vanished into the sea, never to return. These individual tragedies combined into a collective nightmare that haunted entire societies. They also left marks on culture itself. Prayers for protection against pirates became common in church liturgies. Songs of mourning were sung not for the dead, but for the missing. Art from coastal regions sometimes shows ships in the distance, shadowy symbols of fear rather than freedom. The trauma of captivity was not limited to the women themselves. Children born from abuse carried the weight of complicated identities. In some cases, they were raised within pirate communities, never knowing their mothers' homes. In others, they were abandoned or sold, their lives shaped by a crime that began before they were even born. These children stood as living reminders of violence, and their existence further deepened the shame that communities carried. Silence became the easiest way to cope, but silence also erased them from history. Even when women were rescued, their ordeals were far from over. Returning home did not guarantee peace. Many were treated with suspicion, as though their captivity had stained them. Families might keep them hidden, refusing to speak of what had happened. Some women were forced into convents where the rest of their lives was spent in cloistered silence. Others were pushed into marriages designed to cover the shame of their past. In every case, society's reaction compounded the harm, proving that pirates' cruelty did not end when the raid was over. It lingered in the judgment of neighbors, in whispers behind closed doors, and in the refusal to acknowledge victims as survivors. This double erasure, first by pirates, then by society, is why these stories are so rare today. They exist only in fragments, pieced together by historians from scattered documents. And yet, even in fragmentary form, they reveal a truth powerful enough to challenge centuries of myth. Piracy was not glamorous. It was not a life of freedom or rebellion against unjust systems. For women, piracy meant the destruction of body, spirit, and community. It was terror disguised as adventure, cruelty disguised as courage, and slavery disguised as freedom. The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that the suffering of women captured by pirates was not random chaos, but a cold system. Every raid, every abduction, every sale was part of a larger machinery that treated women as resources. Just as pirates catalogued barrels of rum or sacks of gold, they catalogued the women they took. Descriptions were passed along in whispers or written down in crude lists. Words like young, healthy, or pleasing reduced human lives to qualities of trade. The cruelty was not only in the actions, but in the language itself. By stripping women of identity, pirates turned people into property, ensuring that their crimes felt less like violence and more like business. This attitude was reinforced by the way pirates viewed fear as a weapon. When pirates attacked a town, they knew that seizing women would spread terror more effectively than stealing silver. Families might recover from the loss of money, but the loss of daughters or wives cut deeper. The community would carry that scar for generations. Pirates thrived on this, understanding that fear created submission. Towns that resisted one raid often surrendered the next time, hoping to avoid the horror of losing more women. Fear became a currency, and women's suffering was the coin that bought pirate power. One of the darkest aspects of this system was how it shaped the choices of victims. Women knew that capture often meant a fate worse than death. Some chose to leap into the sea rather than face it. Stories survive of women who threw themselves from cliffs as pirate ships approached, their final act one of desperate defiance. These acts were not simply about avoiding suffering. They were also about preserving dignity in the face of humiliation. In a world where pirates reduced them to objects, choosing death was a way to reclaim a fragment of control. These stories, passed down in local memory, reveal the impossible choices women were forced to make, but not every woman had that chance. Many were taken alive, forced to endure captivity that could last weeks, months, or even years. The constant threat of violence created a climate where survival meant enduring unspeakable abuse. For some, this meant adapting to the role forced upon them, becoming servants, concubines, or bargaining pieces. For others, it meant retreating into silence, shutting down emotionally to escape the horror. Whatever path they chose, it was not freedom. It was survival within a system designed to break them. The global reach of piracy meant that women of many different cultures suffered these fates. European, African, Asian, and indigenous women all became targets at different times. Pirates did not discriminate in their cruelty. To them, women were valuable no matter where they came from. This universality of suffering shows how piracy was less about rebellion and more about exploitation. The myth of pirates as freedom-loving adventurers collapses when confronted with the reality that their freedom was built on the chains of others. The silence of history makes these truths easy to overlook. Most official accounts describe pirate raids in terms of ships lost, cargo stolen, or men killed. The absence of women's stories is not proof that they were spared, but proof that their suffering was erased. The world preferred to look away, to preserve the illusion of piracy as romantic, rather than confront its horror. By ignoring the victims, history allowed myths to thrive. Today, when we watch movies or read novels about daring buccaneers, we inherit that silence. We see the adventure, but not the agony, the gold, but not the grief. To confront this hidden history is to strip away centuries of illusion. It means recognizing that piracy's most lasting legacy was not treasure, but trauma. The women who disappeared into that system are not nameless shadows. They were people with families, dreams, and lives that were torn apart. Their absence is a reminder of the cost of forgetting. If we only celebrate the legends of pirates, we participate in the same silence that erased their victims. To tell their story now is not just history. It is justice, long delayed but still necessary. As piracy entered its so-called golden age, the brutal treatment of women only became more entrenched. By the early 18th century, pirate havens stretched from the Caribbean to Madagascar. These places became notorious not just for treasure, but also for their role in human trafficking. In hidden coves and fortified ports, pirates created markets where women were exchanged as casually as goods. Merchants, corrupt officials, and local warlords often cooperated, ensuring that piracy remained profitable. Women caught in this web rarely had a chance to escape. Once sold, they could be moved from one region to another, disappearing into distant lands where no one knew their names. The scale of this trafficking was staggering. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of people were captured by pirates in the Mediterranean alone, with a significant portion being women. In the Caribbean, similar numbers disappeared into the networks of slavery and forced labor. Each number represents a life uprooted, a family destroyed, and a community scarred. Yet despite this, popular memory remembers pirates as daring outlaws rather than as traffickers of human beings. The contrast between myth and reality could not be more stark. Part of this myth-making came from the pirates themselves. They enjoyed cultivating reputations as fearsome but exciting figures. Stories of buried treasure, codes of honor, and democratic ships helped paint them as rebels rather than criminals. But these self-made legends were built on lies. Pirate codes may have spoken of fairness among men, but they had nothing to say about the treatment of women. The silence of these documents reveals the truth. Women were not considered part of the pirate community. They were property, tools, and trophies. The celebrated democracy of pirate crews ended where women's suffering began. The treatment of women also revealed how pirates viewed power. For them, domination was not only about wealth, but also about control over others. To take a woman by force was to humiliate her family, her community, and her nation. It was a message that pirates could not only defeat men in battle, but also claim their most vulnerable. This form of psychological warfare magnified their reputation. Stories of captured women spread quickly, ensuring that pirate names inspired terror long before their sails appeared on the horizon. The legend of the pirate as a figure of fear was inseparable from the suffering of women. One chilling detail is how pirates sometimes used women as shields during negotiations or battles. Captives were placed on deck where they could be seen, forcing enemies to hesitate for fear of harming them. These tactics turned victims into weapons, adding another layer of cruelty to their captivity. Women became pawns in deadly games, their lives hanging on the decisions of men who saw them as bargaining tools rather than human beings. Such acts stripped away the last traces of dignity, reducing women to instruments of strategy in a world where survival depended on brutality. The reach of piracy extended even into the lives of women who never set foot on a pirate ship. In towns and villages constantly threatened by raids, women lived in a state of constant anxiety. Every sound of sails on the horizon could signal danger. Families drilled escape plans, hiding daughters in cellars or sending them inland at the first sign of attack. Entire generations of women grew up under this shadow, their lives shaped not by what happened, but by what might happen. The fear of capture was itself a form of captivity, binding communities in chains of dread. Despite all of this, traces of resistance endured. Some women fought back, striking out at their captors even when defeat was certain. Others plotted escapes, seizing moments of chaos during raids or storms to slip away. A few managed to survive long enough to tell their stories, though many were silenced by shame or disbelief. These glimpses of defiance remind us that women were not only victims, but also survivors who resisted in whatever ways they could. Their courage, though often unrecorded, stands as a quiet counterpoint to the violence that tried to erase them. The cruelty of piracy reached its darkest point in the way women were valued as commodities. Markets in North Africa, the Caribbean, and even hidden coves in Europe treated women not as people, but as resources to be bought and sold. Price lists recorded details as if they were livestock. Age, beauty, and health all determined what a buyer would pay. The youngest and most attractive fetched high sums, while older women, or those scarred by violence, were sold cheaply. These lists reduce human lives to numbers, a stark reminder that piracy was not an act of rebellion, but a business driven by exploitation. The records also reveal how pirates worked hand in hand with established slave traders. Women captured at sea or along coasts were funneled into existing networks of slavery that stretched across continents. A woman taken from a European village might end up in North Africa, the Middle East, or the Caribbean. Others might be moved inland, hidden in markets far from the coast. These networks made it almost impossible for families to trace or rescue their loved ones. Once a woman disappeared into this system, her identity was stripped away, and she became part of an anonymous tide of suffering. Some families went to extraordinary lengths to try to protect their daughters from this fate. Accounts describe parents scarring their daughters' faces, hoping that visible marks would make them less attractive to captors. Others sent their daughters away during times of heightened danger, hiding them with relatives inland. But these desperate measures could not stop the tide. Pirates were relentless, and no amount of preparation could guarantee safety. The fact that parents felt forced to harm their own children shows how deeply piracy scarred society itself. The psychological warfare extended far beyond physical capture. Pirates understood that terror was as powerful a weapon as any cutlass. By spreading fear of abduction, they controlled entire regions without firing a shot. Villages abandoned coasts, trade slowed, and people altered their lives around the possibility of pirate attacks. This constant pressure reshaped societies, turning thriving communities into hollowed shells. The absence of women, taken, hidden, or shamed, left holes in families that could never be filled. Piracy's impact was not limited to the individuals who suffered. It rippled outward, damaging everything it touched. The myth of piracy as adventure ignores this calculated cruelty. Popular tales focus on treasure maps, daring sea battles, and flamboyant captains. These stories erase the reality that for every chest of gold, there were countless women whose lives were destroyed. The silence of history makes this erasure easier to believe, but confronting the truth demands that we remember piracy as it was. A system built on fear, violence, and human suffering. To celebrate pirates without acknowledging their victims is to perpetuate the very silence that allowed their crimes to continue. For the women who endured captivity, survival itself was an act of resistance. Every day lived in the face of such brutality was proof of resilience. Some managed to escape, others endured until ransom secured their release, and a few left behind testimonies that still speak across centuries. Though their voices are faint, they break through the silence and remind us that even in the darkest times, humanity endures. Their survival stories deserve to be remembered alongside the myths of pirates, for they reveal the true cost of the seas we romanticize today. The scars left by piracy on women's lives also shaped the way communities remembered their past. In many coastal towns, stories of pirate raids were passed down not as adventurous tales, but as warnings. Mothers told children to behave, or pirates would come for them, sir. Priests led prayers not only for safe voyages, but also for protection from abduction. These practices turned memory into a tool of survival, embedding fear deep into culture. Even long after the last pirate ships disappeared from the horizon, the memory of women taken remained alive in whispered stories and family traditions. Some of these traditions survive even today. In parts of Ireland and Spain, folk songs still carry verses about women carried off to distant lands. These songs rarely speak in detail about what happened, but instead mourn the loss itself. A name, a face, a cry in the night. These fragments lingered in cultural memory, keeping alive the reality that piracy had stolen more than wealth. It had stolen futures, families, and generations of women whose voices were never heard. Through song, grief found a way to endure even when history books stayed silent. The silence of official records stands in stark contrast to these folk memories. Governments often had no interest in preserving the truth. Admitting the full scale of piracy's impact on women meant admitting failure to protect their citizens. Naval commanders boasted about victories at sea but rarely mentioned the women lost during raids. Merchants calculated profits and losses in ledgers, but the human toll did not appear in the numbers. This erasure was convenient for the powerful, who preferred to remember piracy as a nuisance rather than a humanitarian catastrophe. For the victims, it was another form of betrayal, as though their suffering did not matter enough to record.